Good morning, everyone. We're going to study the difference between Jesus' God and Paul's God, and we're going to also learn what was the purpose of Luke's Gospel and what was the purpose of the book of Acts. How did the early church, the Ebionites, the apostolic church, deal with the book of Luke? Did it accept it? The answer is yes. What did it think of the book of Acts? It rejected it. But we'll see why and what was the purpose of the book of Acts as we go forth, but basically it was intended to help. Luke was trying to help a Roman investigator named Theophilus to be prepared, or to prepare Nero for the hearing when Paul would be brought before him. Anyway, so this video is going to be unusual because we're going to kind of go step by step, and it's a progression. Anyway, so the first question we're going to address is just to establish who is the original church. What is the name of the earliest church led by James, Peter, and John? We'll see that was the Ebionites. Second, what do they think is New Testament scripture? Do they think it's just Matthew? Do they think it also includes Luke? Did they rule on the book of Acts? Was it admissible as scripture, meaning something that we should be reading, even studying? And what did they think of Paul's? The third question. So this is going to help us realize what was at stake for the apostolic church when Paul got arrested at the temple for having allegedly brought Trophimus, the Ephesian friend of his, who went into the temple uncircumcised. That was undisputed. He went into the holy area where it has a death penalty sign above it when you go under the door. But he went anyway, and we'll discuss that maybe in another video. But that's what's going on in the book of Acts. It's all about what Trophimus did, the defilement of the temple. Our teachers almost never want to tell us about that. But anyway, that's what this is about. And I think you'll learn a lot about Christian background and actually also the validity of Paul or invalidity of Paul, depending on how you want to look at it. Okay, so let's begin. So the first thing we'll look at is what was the name of Christians? What did people call Christians back then? The word Christian wasn't used until much later. That's even mentioned in Acts 15. So what was the original name? The original name was the Ebionites. So this is in a book edited by Philip Schaff, a mainstream religious Protestant Christian. And this is an article by Mr. Ullhorn entitled Ebionites, a religious encyclopedia or dictionary, etc. At page 684. And the book you can find on the internet. This designation was at first, the designation Ebionites was at first, like Nazarenes, a common name for all Christians, as Epiphanius, who died in 403, testifies. It is derived from the Hebrew word Ebion, which means poor. We'll see how important that is. And we can actually prove that Paul referred to the early church as the Ebion, because he uses the word in Greek for the word poor, and in context he's implying that's who he's asked to help in the future. So in Galatians 2:9, Paul writes, James, Cephas, which is actually Peter's other name, and John, who seemed to be pillars, meaning leaders of the church, they desired only that we should remember the poor, probably in prayer, the very thing which I also was eager to do. Okay, so Jerome was the one who said he knew Hebrew, he knew the name of the early church as being the Ebionites, so he said that Paul's reference to them as the poor did not mean to simply mean economically poor people, but that they called themselves the poor. And so in Stephen Cooper's book Marius Victorinus, Oxford 2005 at 277, he writes, Jerome's more historically correct reading, for whom the poor here, Galatians 2:9, are the Jewish believers of Acts 2:44-5. But more specifically, Jerome is saying these three gentlemen, James, the brother of Jesus, Peter, the apostle, John, the apostle, these pillars of the church are the leaders of what's known as the Ebionites. We'll see why that's important. Okay, so one of the reasons the nature of the Ebionites is important is to understand the authority of what you're now going to hear. Who's speaking and telling us down from history to repudiate Paul. It's those three men, those leaders. Okay, and we'll discuss in other videos where Apostle John very clearly does this in the book of Revelation, clearly destroys Paul, and also in his gospel, if you know how to translate the word pistoo when it's when it's before the word eis preposition, that means obey unto someone, and that's what he did 36 times, but it was translated by Luther is always being believe in, believe in, believe in, believe in. Okay, anyway, but who are these Ebionites, and what was their decision? So in 180 AD, Irenaeus writes a thing about against heresies. And in there he mentions the Ebionites. Those who are called Ebionites use the gospel according to Matthew only and repudiate the Apostle Paul, maintaining that he was an apostate from the law. So this is the what the leaders of our church had concluded, and we'll see why in a minute. Now, let me just show you there's a way of linking up our original church, and James in particular, with this charge that will eventually become outright proof or determination that Paul's guilty of apostasy and repudiate him. So we actually see in Acts 21:21 that the very word apostasy is used by James, the brother of Jesus, the bishop of Jerusalem, of the 12 appointed. That is something you'd learn from Eusebius, that the 12 had chosen James, the brother of Jesus, to be the bishop of the church. And that's what his role is in Acts 15. Here in Acts 21, which is 6 chapters later, he's confronting Paul, and he's going to tell Paul, we've heard something about you and what you're doing and what you're teaching, and it's a problem for us, so we want you to assure us it's not true. And of course, he assures, Paul does exactly what James tells him to do to reassure him, and that is go help these 6 guys go do their Nazirite vows and pay their fees to do that. Anyway, but here's the key. In Acts 21, this is the Mountsey transliteral. You can get this on Bible Gateway. It's a good idea almost on any time you want to know what words mean in a verse. Just change the default Bible you're looking at to the Mountsey, M-O-U-N-C-E. And anyway, it reads this way. But they were told about you. This is James talking to Paul. But they, the apostles, were told about you that you are teaching all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses. That's how it's translated to us. But what it really should say is apostatize against Moses. All right, but let's keep going. Because you see below the word forsake, you see that it says apostasia, telling them not to circumcise their children and not to walk according to our customs, our ethos. Anyway, so it's not a coincidence that the Ebionites in history were known to have repudiated Paul, because based on apostasy, which means declaring that God's law given through Moses should be annulled. Okay, that is apostasy 101. You are trying to seduce someone from the law, and if you don't know where that is, you can just go look at Deuteronomy 13, 1 to 10, and when they would translate those terms back into Greek later in the Septuagint, the word apostasy would be used in verse 10. And it meant that if you try to seduce someone from following God's law, God says that person's a false prophet, even if they have signs and wonders to seduce you. Don't listen to them. So that's the meaning of the word apostasy. That's where it comes from in the law, and that's what James is telling him. You are apparently, the very person who fits the profile of a Deuteronomy 13, 1 to 10 person, and we're concerned. And so he says, you know what? You can show everyone that this is not true, and you can just do the go do the Nazirite vow with these 6 gentlemen, pay their way, and everyone will see that this is totally scurrilous rumors against you. Okay, and he does it. And by the way, Jerome faults Paul for that later. He says, what hypocrisy to do that. So just to show you, in history, legitimate Christian leaders, Jerome wrote the Vulgate Bible, was one of the key leaders of the church in the late 300s and early 400s. He wrote the Vulgate of 405. He was trusted by the Pope to do this task, and he spent 26 years translating the Bible, by the way. I mean, so it was a lifelong project, and that's what he viewed Paul's actions there. But this is not about that. This is about what the Ebionites were, and so they were the original church. They were James, they were Peter, they were John. What also makes this clear that they were this one and the same is we saw the Ebionites are the original church, right? So that's the three leaders, and they repudiated Paul because of apostasy. Now we come at it from just simply this reference in Ambrosiaster's book, his review of or commentary on the book of Corinthians. And he writes this about 373, 84 AD, and this is what he's going to say. He's going to tell us how the apostles, not the word Ebionites, but just the apostles viewed Paul. And he says it matter-of-factly, so let's listen. Those Jewish believers who nevertheless continued to observe the law of Moses denied that Paul was an apostle because he taught that it was no longer necessary to be circumcised or to observe the Sabbath. Even the other apostles thought that he was teaching something different because of this. And they, the other apostles, they denied that he was an apostle. But to the Corinthians, Paul was an apostle because they had seen the signs of God's power in him. So see, they were carried away by the signs and wonder. And what were we told in Deuteronomy 13, 1-10? Oh, if the prophet has signs and wonders, but he's trying to seduce you, cause you to apostatize against God's law. Okay, so what God's law was for all Gentiles was Sabbath. If you were a sojourner in the community, you had to do Sabbath with everybody else. That was one command. As to circumcision, that was very optional. If you wanted to go in the temple, you had to be circumcised, or if you wanted to celebrate Passover. That was Exodus, I think it's 34. So limited, but still, you can't do away with it completely. These were what Paul was known for, teaching against these two things, and they thought he was an apostate. And that's why, Ambrosiaster says, that's why the apostles, the original apostles, rejected Paul and said he wasn't an apostle. And notice it's matter of fact, and notice he's not an enemy of Paul, he's pro-Paul, and he's just reflecting on something that everybody appeared to know, except you'll see that had to be suppressed over time because the Roman church needed Paul to help them get rid of Sabbath rest and make sure people switched to the day of the sun, which the pagan rulers of Rome were sun worshippers, Sol Invictus, particularly Constantine was. Okay, let's go to the next slide here. All right, so now Irenaeus in 180 is going to talk about the book of Luke and the book of Acts. So Irenaeus writes this about the Ebionites. They do not recognize Paul as an apostle, but make use of the gospel we have come to know through Luke, but reject the book of Acts. So what's interesting is they primarily relied upon Matthew, we learned earlier. But they also made use, which means they found it was useful. It had some parts that they thought were good and legitimate, but they completely rejected the book of Acts. So we're going to find out through this presentation today why they rejected the book of Acts as something that people should be reading for edification. But you could read the book of Luke for edification and the Gospel of Luke. And we'll see Professor Edwards in the book he wrote called The Hebrew Matthew and the Synoptic Tradition. He concluded that Luke was translating the Hebrew Matthew, which was in a repository in a library in North Africa. And that's where Jerome found it in the 380 period and began a long period of translating the Hebrew Matthew, which he did, but it offended too many people because it had certain changes. And anyway, it was apparently destroyed, all that work, but he believed in it, and that's reflected in his commentary on Matthew because he quotes from it 22 times, his translation. Okay, anyway, but the point is, what are we going to learn about? Can we use the book of Luke? Should we be afraid of it just because Luke's considered a, quote, friend of Paul? No, we shouldn't be worried about that. The book of Acts, we should realize that's not intended for Christians or anybody to read as a means of gaining any positive feeling about Paul as Christians. So we'll see why I'm saying that. And just to preview that, it's it was not intended for us. We'll see why. It was intended for Theophilus, a Roman investigator for Nero for the trial that was upcoming. And the book of Acts is written while Luke is at Rome because he's followed Paul all the way there, and Paul's going to be on trial. And so this is trial preparation time. These are things that had to be put in order and given to Theophilus for purposes of helping him know how to win the case for the Christians. That we wouldn't be banned. Nero, you could only be a religion inside of Rome if you were licensed or permitted. And Judaism had won that permission, and Christians were considered Jews initially, so we were under their protection. But now, from what happened at the temple with Paul and Trophimus, that was put at risk that we could become delegitimized and banned, basically, in Roman law. If you're not licensed, you can't operate, you can't meet, you can't teach, you can't print books, can't circulate anything. So that would have been a death knell for Christianity unless Luke could win this case and write the gospel to help Theophilus and anybody else who wanted to know about Christ. And then he wrote the book of Acts. And so these things have two different purposes. Okay, so now we're going to actually begin our study that's going to lead us up to understanding what's going on at Mars Hill. This is where Paul's going to talk to these philosophers in Athens, and they're going to hear from Paul pointing at a statue of the unknown God, and Paul's going to say, "That's my God. That's my God. I worship that God." And so to understand whether that was a good or bad thing he did is to adopt a statue of Yahweh as if it were of Yahweh. Shouldn't he have had a moral compunction against doing that based on commands in the Bible? And just to review that, we're going to look at the book by Friedman from 2001, Commentary on the Torah. This is considered the latest excellent commentary with the new translation of the Torah, and Jewish people, love this book, and it's actually, I think, very good for Christians to have too, because it's very informative and the footnotes are fantastic. All right, so we'll begin this study from just reading Exodus 20, verse 4. It's the second command of the Ten Commandments. And it reads, "You shall not make a statue or any form that is in the skies above, or that is in the earth below, or that is in the water below the earth. You shall not bow to them, and you shall not serve them, because I, Yahweh your God, am a jealous God." So this is a rule against making statues of things that are in the sky, earth, water below. But the Jewish people are going to interpret this to even not make a statue of Yahweh. All right, so let's go to the next slide. Okay, in the commentary on Torah by Friedman at page 236 and 237, he's going to explain how Jews came to understand that command was a prohibition also about making statues of Yahweh. And the issue then was not making statues of the pagan gods, but making statues of Yahweh. In the first place, Yahweh was not to be identified with any single force in nature. Likewise, a statue would limit what Yahweh was, identifying God with something visible in this world. Moreover, multiple statues of Yahweh in multiple places would not be felt to be consistent with God's oneness. In the Torah, only one temple is permitted, only one sacrificial altar. Sacrifice of Yahweh is not permitted anywhere else on earth. I hadn't thought about that. Leviticus 17, Deuteronomy 12. So that was the unique place on earth you could worship God. And that was the unique place he would dwell on earth. Confirmation of the fact that the issue is making statues of Yahweh comes from archaeological evidence. Small figures of females are extremely common finds, meaning statues of females. But in all the excavations in Israel so far, only 2 male figures have ever been found. And one of them, which my friend Yigal Shalom uncovered in the city of David, excavations of biblical Jerusalem, was clearly not Israelite. That is, female figures often escaped the ban on statues, but male figures did not. Not because they were Baal or dragon figures, but because they could be Yahweh. So that's just to underscore when Paul's going to point at this statue of the unknown God and claim that's his God, he was aware that in Judaism that was offensive to say that God was a statue. You could identify him as statue, because that's yeah, the command is explicitly against making it of birds and fish and all that kind of stuff. But the people had construed it as, you know what? We can't make a statue of God. That will offend the oneness of God. You know, it's changing our worship into an object instead of to the God's spirit, His light in the temple, and so on. So this is why I'm just pointing out it's doubtful that Paul had a very conscientious approach to his hearers on Mars Hill, but we'll see not just for that reason, but for a lot of other reasons as it comes up. And so, before getting to the Mars Hill events, where Paul talks about this unknown God. This is a picture of the unknown God here. This is him here. It says, is an altar base with statue of God figure. Ephesus Museum, frieze reliefs from Temple of Hadrian at Ephesus. The second from the left is the unknown God on the altar. So this is him. So he has a little altar. He's not very big. It's just his bust. All the other gods are much bigger than him. So he's the unknown God. He's not really considered too important. Which is a kind of another thing. Is like, would it make sense to point to the least significant of all the gods that he's like half the height of all the other ones? I mean, think about how pagans really would think of what Paul is saying. But anyway, I digress. But it is a fact of history that there was this altar to the unknown God, and it was used typically. So the pagans were trying to make sure they didn't miss somebody. And this is just another example of the same thing, except this is an altar kept at a museum, and it's just the altar part, not the statue of the unknown God, but it's inscribed altar to the unknown God, or altare a Dio ignoto. This must be in Italy somewhere. It's late 2nd, early 1st century BC. So this is before the time of Paul, but it still existed in the time of Paul. So it's very much a historical fact. There was this thing called the unknown God. And here's a classic painting depicting Paul preaching regarding the unknown God. So this shows you him standing there and telling the people of Greece about the unknown God, and he's referring to this statue. Now, it's interesting, in this statue, this God's big, but we saw that the actual way he was being depicted was like small, regardless. But that's the idea. So Paul is using the statue of the unknown God to his advantage in a discussion. Let's put it that way. Okay, so the first verse we study in Acts 17, where Paul begins, is where he's pointing at the statue. And that's the flaw, I think, in this. That's a mistake. That's not a good tactic. He writes, or he says, verse 23, for as I passed by and beheld your devotions, I found an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God, whom you therefore ignorantly worship, him I declare unto you. Now, by the way, it actually seems like maybe it isn't even there. He's recalling something had happened when he was walking around. So but he's putting that into their mind. The listeners, that he saw something today. It's this altar unknown God. I'm going to declare him to you. That's why it's even worse. It's not that it's even there. It's not an object in front of him. He's calling to their mind the unknown God and making them think of a statue, and that's probably God. I don't think God would appreciate us to ever say, if somebody was worshiping an object and it was called the unknown God, and we said, that's the God I worship, that just doesn't sound like God would approve of that. All right, so these are just comments I wanted to overview with you. Paul appears clever, right? This is like, people call him ingenious and brilliant for this. Feels clever, but he's saying this unknown God depicted at the altar nearby, apparently in the area, was Yahweh. I mean, that's just wrong. Paul initially appears approving that Yahweh can be depicted by a statue. That's how, if I were a pagan, I wouldn't sense that you have any problem that we use statues for your God. In fact, you seem to be adopting it. So it's starting off on the wrong foot. It's giving the wrong impression. Let's maybe put it that way. Next, we'll turn to verse 24, and this one is a linchpin problem for Paul from our perspective, but not from a pagan perspective. So here's verse 24. God that made the world and all things therein, seeing that he is Lord of heaven and earth, dwells not in temples made with hands. Now, we all know that's biblically false, right? God dwelled in the temple of Jerusalem. The temple fell in 70 AD. God departed. The temple's never been rebuilt. God dwelled in that temple for millennia. There were actually 2 successive temples, and he lived in each one. His spirit resided at all times. The Bible talks of him dwelling there, and so on. We'll see how exactly. So we know that this is biblically false, but these people are hearing him, and Paul is describing a God that's not like Jesus' God. Paul's God doesn't dwell in a temple made of human hands. But we'll continue here. I want to expand a little bit on verse 24 so we can see what the Greek word was there, because we're going to see Jesus actually affirms the exact opposite of what Paul says here. So he says, 17:24, God does not dwell in temples made with hands. And the Greek word is cheiropoietois, okay, made with hands. So it doesn't dwell in a temple, cheiropoietois, made with hands. Jesus says the opposite, we'll see. So I titled this line, Jesus' God is not Paul's God, because this is where it really comes down to it for Christians. Again, the book of Acts is not meant for us. It's meant for a pagan investigator named Theophilus, that he would help win the case for the Christians. So Theophilus is, many people say he was a magistrate that by tradition. So he's a lawyer trained in the law, was apparently hired by the Christians to defend Paul. And that's what the whole project of the book of Luke and the book of Acts is designed, is to provide this information to this magistrate so he could help the Christians not be banned if Paul were somehow found guilty, hopefully get him off. If not, make sure it doesn't reverberate on the Christians. We didn't teach what he was teaching to let people go into the past the middle wall and violate the temple and commit a defilement of the temple. We didn't do that. So anyway, here's what Jesus says. It's inconsistent with what Paul says in verse 24 there. Jesus says, and he who swears by the temple swears by it, and the one who dwells in it. So does God dwell in temples? Yes. Okay. Did Jesus ever say the temple was made with human hands? Yes. Mark 14:58. Jesus elsewhere referred to the temple at Jerusalem as the, quote, temple made with hands. In that one, it's cheiropoieton, but it's just a different way of saying it based on its case in context. So Jesus completely eviscerates Paul's statements. And by the way, it's not even just Jesus, it's just a known fact of Judaism that God does dwell in a temple made of human hands. It's in the Bible. It's over and over again. So Paul is saying something completely false biblically. And so was Luke trying to expose Paul, make him look like a person who doesn't understand the Bible? No, he's trying to win a legal case. So he's willing to put things out there that would please the Nero, and these people would say, "Oh, Paul isn't doing anything wrong." And in fact, if you think about what's the most important part of this whole book of Acts, it's this issue. Why? Because in 17:24 of Acts, Paul is saying the temple is not made with human hands and God doesn't dwell in there. Why is that important to win the case? Because the Romans are probably totally puzzled. Why do these Jews think their God lives in that temple? Our gods, none of the pagan gods, lived in their temples. They might visit for a ceremony or two, but they would leave because they don't live there. They live at Mount Olympus. Rome and Greece shared this concept that the gods don't live in temples. So Paul is saying something that they agree with immediately, and that this means if Trophimus enters, his friend, enters into the sacred area, because God dwells there and that defends him and defiles his house, the Romans are going, and the Greeks would say, what are they worried about? God doesn't dwell there. Why does their God dwell in this building? Our gods don't do that. So Paul is basically saying, this whole thing about Trophimus is just some Jewish myth. Some group of people think he lives there, and they're worried about people going in there and violating the temple. But you and I all know, we all know that he doesn't live there. So this is how Paul's advocates at trial, using Luke's account here, could actually try to convince the investigator that this is not a big issue. That God doesn't dwell in the temple made of human hands. So the fact that Trophimus went in there didn't violate anything. God doesn't even live there. This is important, therefore, for winning the case. This seemingly innocuous reference to God doesn't dwell in temples made of human hands, a false biblical statement, but very advantageous for the defense team to create a concept that Paul shouldn't be held responsible, neither should Trophimus, for this violation, alleged violation of the temple, because it didn't violate anything at all. God doesn't even dwell there. All right, I just want to then show you in contrast in columns. So we have Jesus' view in this slide on the left and Paul's view on the right. And again, the point here so far is Jesus' God is not Paul's God. That's clear as day. So Jesus is saying that God dwells in the temple, Matthew 23:21, and he's saying it's a temple made with hands in Mark 14:58 for sure. And Paul's view is the opposite. His Mars Hill speech, he clearly claims that God that made the world and all things therein, seeing that he is Lord of heaven, dwells not in temples made with hands. And he uses the word cheiropoietois, and Jesus in Mark 14:58 used cheiropoieton, so a different form of the exact same word. All right, so they are opposite. Jesus' God is not Paul's God. And then Paul in the next verse goes into a fairly shockingly false biblical statement. Neither is the unknown God, meaning his God Yahweh, worshipped with or by men's hands. Greek is care, so now you can see where cheiropoieton comes from, their hands. So it's not worship with men's hands as though he needed anything, seeing he gives to all life and breath and all things. Okay, so biblically, this is false. You know, David put up holy hands. There's all kinds of reference to that. And even the construction of the temple will be described as doing it with your hands. So I can only imagine as they were building the temple and they're building it with their hands, is that was considered a form of worship to God. You're honoring him, you're loving him, you're working hard to serve God. And so here Paul says, no, God does not have anybody worship with their hands. So God, God's such a spirit that he does not have that kind of worship. And I double checked that it was the word worship in Greek. So you'll see here in the Mouncy reverse interlinear, it's therapio, worship. So clearly, Paul is denying some aspect about God's nature, which is completely false. But by the way, I mean, it's same for the Roman pagans. They didn't have to feed their gods or take care of their gods or have a house for God or do any of that. They were just gods that existed and lived on Mount Olympus. So this is again resonating with them that Paul has the same view of God or a god as they have of their own gods. And so he's debasing God, if you will, in order to appeal to these people. He's going to say something partly true at the end here, so we'll see. And next, again, on my theme here, this interim part of our discussion, Jesus' God is not Paul's God. Put it on the left, put it on the right. You see how vastly different these are. But this time I want you to see John 2, verse 16. So on the left it says, Jesus cleansed the temple, saying, quote, make not the house of my Father a house of merchandise. So clearly Jesus twice in Matthew and John talks about the temple being the house of God. But what does Paul say? He doesn't dwell there, and then he claims that God doesn't need anything and so on, and he doesn't get worshipped by hands. So this again, completely different God between Jesus' God and Paul's God, at least how Paul's talking to the pagans. And here is the example I was thinking of earlier about Exodus 25 verse 8. You could look at Exodus 40 verses 34 to 35. This 25 verse 8 says, let them construct a sanctuary for me that I may dwell, Shakan, among them. So what did Paul say? Neither is the unknown God worshipped with worshipped with or by men's hands, as though he needed anything, seeing he gives to all life and breath and all things. So clearly, Paul doesn't acknowledge that the Bible says men have ever used their hands to worship God, build a temple, for example. But that's what the Bible says. So again, it's a counter-biblical narrative here, but it's appealing to pagans to hear this kind of God exists. He's like our God. Well, who is he? You know. And by the way, if I were a pagan, I would have thought he's talking about Zeus, and he just doesn't understand our religion. You know, because he's talking about sort of supreme God, and Zeus comes closest to that. Okay, so now in furtherance of Jesus' God is not Paul's God, we can see Paul is now going to describe God not by a biblical quote, try to persuade them to the Bible or anything like that. He's going to use their poets. And poets in their culture were considered inspired because they're writing poetry that rhymes. Okay, that's a pagan idea. Anyway, so the number one quote is in verse 28. In him we live and move and have our being. So that's from Epiomenides. It's the red words. And then it says, as certain also of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring. And that's a combination of Aratus and Cleanthes. So these are pagan ideas, and we'll see it's very significant. Number one is Paul is affirming a pantheistic quote, because that's a saying that we, when we're walking around, we're living inside of God. That's how pagans viewed things. Not that God's Holy Spirit would come dwell in us, but that we actually, as we walk around, we're actually dwelling in God's existence. He exists everywhere. So he is in everything, everywhere. So as we walk through our house, we're walking through God. That's how they viewed it. You know, God's everywhere. So that's contra-biblical. So Epimenides' view is not biblical, is anti-biblical. It's pantheism, and it's not true. And Paul Fan quotes this pantheistic quote. He mentions it as pantheistic, and then he says, Paul's sermon on the Areopagus was a masterpiece. In his oration, he appealed to two Greek poets the patrons might well have heard or read. And then he goes through the whole thing. The first statement in Acts 17:20 is from Epimenides, the Cretan, a poet. The original line, in him we move and live and have our being, was pantheistic. So there's no misunderstanding from Mr. Roston. He understands what Paul's doing. He's saying my God is pantheistic. You know, we live and move in his being rather than his spirit lives in us or something like that, which is biblical. So definitely Paul is appealing to a pantheistic God in order to get them to like him, to appreciate him, or to listen to him. But that's relying upon a false image of God to persuade someone to God. Probably not a good idea. So I want to make a comment. The we audience hears the pagan notion that all of us, sinner or not, are already in God. So that's what they're hearing on the other side, as proof that God does not ever seek our worship by handmade work. So that's, when you put it all together, is he doesn't need us. You know, he's self-existent everywhere. Everywhere we walk, wherever we go, he is everything. So he has no need of anything from us. So he isn't served by human hands. He doesn't need a temple. He doesn't even live in temples of human hands. It's not where he lives. He lives everywhere is actually what Paul's saying. He's everywhere. That's a real different kind of God than Jesus' God. Paul actually never, by the end of the speech, ever corrects this problem that he started by quoting pantheism. He never corrected the fact that he's saying we are in God instead of God in us. If God comes into us and his Holy Spirit dwells in us, that's how it works. He's in us. We're not living and breathing inside of him, his being. His being is not the universe. Next, I want to comment on Paul quoting in verse 28, for of him also we are offspring, that is genus or progeny. So he's quoting Aratus here, who is referring to being the offspring of Zeus or Cleanthes, which implies likewise. So what is the problem with that? Is in a pagan mind, their gods procreated. physically with humans and with other gods. They were really no different than us. I mean, if you saw them, they would look just like us. Maybe they're bigger or more, stronger looking, but basically they're humanoid. And so he is described that we are their offspring. Well, to a pagan mind, that means, your God might be actually, we each are being born by one of these gods procreating around us somewhere with people. And so that's where we came from. That's how they think of it. And so they all kind of had this sense of divinity, or, if you had that mindset that you were an offspring of God, that was the whole idea. But, we are offspring of the seed of Adam all the way to the present. Okay, that's where we came from, and we're ultimately connected to God that way. But we are not offspring in the way a pagan would think we are. So it wasn't a good idea to even bring up that quote either, that we are all his offspring. All right, so here's a quote I got. I think it might have been from an encyclopedia. I'm trying to remember where I got this from. But anyway, in the Greek imagination, literature, and art, the gods were given human bodies and characters, both good and bad. And just as ordinary men and women, they married, had children, often through illicit affairs, fought in the stories of Greek mythology. They directly intervened in human affairs. So again, this is why saying that we are their offspring did not mean what you and I would think Paul meant by that. Or we might think he meant by that. They were taking it as this God, Yahweh, is like your gods, has a human body, he procreates, and so on. And here is a definition of, or a description of Zeus in Encyclopedia Britannica. So again, in the quote from Aratus, it was, "For of him also we are offspring." So who is the him? Well, he means Yahweh, but it doesn't use his name. But in the pagan mind, who you're talking about is their head god, which is Zeus. So who is Zeus? Zeus in ancient Greek religion was the chief deity of the pantheon, a sky and weather god who was identical with the Roman god Jupiter. His wife was Hera. Among his offspring were Apollo, Athena, and by the goddess Semele, Dionysius. Okay, and to quote the next verse that Paul says, "Being therefore offspring of God, we ought not to think God, Theos, to be like to gold or silver or stone, graving of art and device of man." So he doesn't refer to him as Yahweh. He doesn't use a personal name. He uses an abstract name, God, which they would not identify as the one God. So what's my comment here? Paul says you should not think of the creator God, whom Paul promotes as a graving of art. That's good. That's biblical, and that's consistent with what Friedman was saying. But up to this point, until verse 29, he's let them think that this statue that he's recalling to their minds is his God. But now he's trying to peel that back. So I'm going to give him credit, but he put his own foot into it, so now he's got to peel back and say that's not how we should think of God, as a graven image of art. Second, though, Paul does not say this attitude change applies to the other 12 gods in the Athenian pantheon. So what are they going to think? Well, okay, Zeus is what he's talking about. He's telling us about Zeus. He's the head god, and he's saying, don't think of him as graven art. But you haven't told us the other 11 gods, or actually there's 12 gods underneath Zeus. You haven't told us that we should treat them any differently than we do now. So we have statues. You're not telling us we got to peel down these statues, are you? No. Not, but he's saying the God who was our offspring, who in that quote Aratus was talking about, we're offspring of him, meaning Zeus. That's what they're understanding. That's what they're hearing. And the third point I want to say is Paul also in the speech never says there is one God. He simply says the unknown God was creator of the heaven and earth, which to pagans was simply Zeus anyway. So he's not made any inroads with these people to get them away from paganism, except to suggest that one God among all of them doesn't need a statue. And either he's saying, get rid of this unknown God statue because you don't need to, if you want to worship that God, you don't need this statue. That seemingly would be the direct application of what they're saying. He's saying, but they're not hearing that. They're going to be hearing it's your God is Zeus. That's all they're going to hear. And okay, but again, I'm only pointing out that Jesus' God is not Paul's God because this is to win a case in court to get Paul off the hook. These are things he actually said that Luke saw and heard, but he can use it to his advantage. These are things that will appeal to the Roman investigator Theophilus, that he will think better of Paul, that okay, Paul is being philosophical, he understands our pagan world, he thinks like us, and most importantly, this temple is not that sacred that we need to kill Trophimus, let alone kill one of our own citizens. Paul, he seems very artistic and very sensitive and very thoughtful, so we're not going to kill him. That's what this is all about, getting an acquittal at trial, getting Nero's staff to recommend acquittal. Okay, now this is two other more verses. This doesn't end real quick. This is you see there's been now several verses now. This is the fourth verse we're on. So let's just read it. And the times of this ignorance, this is Paul talking at Marcel. And the times of this ignorance God winked at. Now we're going to see that's not what it really means. It's translated better as overlooked. That's the literal words. Winked at seems like childish. God's like winking at things. Like anyway, God winked at, but now commands all men everywhere to repent. That's a good thing, because he has appointed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness by that man whom he has ordained, whereof he has given assurance unto all men, in that he has raised him from the dead. Okay, that's good. So now he's getting closer to talking about Jesus. He's using the terms that are in Psalm 2, where God says, this day I've begotten thee, to his son. And then he tells people to honor the son, kiss his ring. I'm giving him all judgment over mankind. And this is a prophecy of David, of a figure who would be the Messiah. And it's actually, that's the name in the psalm. It's the anointed one. So this is the psalm that prophesied of Jesus Christ. And by using the term Mashiach, which only appears in one other place in a prophetic sense, and I think that's Daniel 7:25, that the Mashiach would come. Okay, anyway, so what's troublesome about verse 30 though is that Paul is going to say that God winked at or overlooked their sins, and as if he was forgiving them. That's kind of what it sounds like. So we'll get that into the next verse. And I don't think God was pleased, and I don't think Paul can read God's mind that he was overlooking it. He was setting up a people who would be holy and righteous and would be able to communicate to the Gentile world a more sacred view of God, that he was consonant with his being. Okay. So just to do a quick reference here. So what was translated is winked at in the Mouncy transliteral. And again, I recommend using Mouncy to double check things, because at least you get a quick idea of the actual meaning of the word. So then God overlooked the times of ignorance. So it's not winked at. Sounds childish behavior by God the way it's translated in King James. God can overlook things. But usually it should be something that's not. I mean, I think the reason the second commandment is against making statues of anything on earth, images to bow down and worship, is because that's offensive to God. So saying he overlooked it, something that offends him, I don't think that would have been the right way to describe it. He hasn't punished you yet, is really how I would put it. You need to repent immediately. In fact, this sounds almost like Paul knows that God's mind has changed. And that gives Paul this heightened view in their mind, which is really improper too. It's like, unless you actually received this command from God last week, Paul, you shouldn't be making it sound like you now have a message that God previously didn't want to bring, but now he's bringing. Why don't you just simply say, God hates these things, hates these statues that you're bowing down to and worshiping, and we should stop doing that. That's what he should have said. Not as if God had overlooked it or tolerates it. But I want to repeat as to verse 31, Acts 17:31. Paul does get this right, and he's trying to educate them about the Messiah. All he really though says is he's been risen from the dead. He doesn't give any special importance to Jesus. Doesn't explain this was to fulfill prophecy or whatever. But of course, you only get 2 or 3 words in a debate with these philosophers, so I'm not going to criticize him for that. But so out of the 4 verses, one of them had sort of a Christian tinge to it, but we don't know the name of this person. He didn't say Jesus. We just know he was risen from the dead by God, which is okay, but nothing more dramatic. No quote, no words of Jesus, no message of Jesus. What was he about? It just seems like all we're told is he's the judge of the world. It's not his only role, so it's sort of a very minimalistic view of Jesus. But anyway, that's basically the end of the Mars Hill speech. Okay, so now the question is, why does Luke depict Paul as almost entirely pagan mindset? So other than the final verse, which is I would call that Christianity light. I mean, so light you can barely know who that person is in the 4th verse. Because why? He knows who he's supposed to please. Luke is aiming to please or get the favorable review of Paul's actions from Theophilus, a magistrate at Rome, according to tradition, who they were hoping would present their case in such a way that the Christians would not be liable. Paul, in particular, would be acquitted. It's not, therefore, designed to appeal to Christians. So here's why you know that's a fact. Okay, Luke knows there is a temple in Jerusalem at which Yahweh resides at that time. So he knows what Paul is saying is false biblically, but he wants the pagans to hear this. This is who the book of Acts is intended for. Luke knows the temple was built by human hands. Again, Luke knows that Paul is stating a biblically false claim that God does not live in a temple made of human hands. But Luke doesn't care because that's not his point. He's trying to win over these pagans because Paul said things that could be adapted to winning the case. This is a very common tactic of lawyers when you go to court. Whatever your client says, you have to accept as true. Okay, so he's accepted, or that he said it. You can, in that may exonerate your client. You may not believe him. You may think he's crazy, but that's what your client says, and it's going to if it exonerates him unintentionally, or whatever. Your job is to use whatever evidence that comes out of your client's mouth that can help that person be judged properly. Now, jury may not believe your client, but that's what the job of an attorney is. Let that client speak to the point. And so that's what's going on here with Luke. He's letting Paul speak and make his case. And again, these points are crucial to winning the case because the temple was violated by Trophimus in Jewish minds, and is a horrible thing. They've got to rededicate a temple, got to do all kinds of things when these things happen. And that happened in, I think it was 163 BC. They had some Gentile went into the holy area. They had to rededicate the entire temple, cleanse the whole thing. I mean, it's a huge thing because that's where God dwells. That's where the God of the universe dwells. And that's why you can't have a Gentile walking in there, transgressing God's law about who goes into his temple, what condition they are. So but the Romans are hearing that this God that the Jews claim is dwelling in their temple, he doesn't even live there. Paul tells us authoritatively he knows for a fact that God doesn't dwell there, and he doesn't dwell in any temple made of human hands. So why are these Jewish people upset with Paul? Why are they upset with Trophimus? What a waste of our time. We got other things to do. We don't want to deal with these people. They think it's myth. See, you got to see it from their perspective. And Paul's helping them believe that the Jews believe in a myth, that a God exists and dwells in a building. Okay, third point. Luke knows, quoting, that we are all offspring is about Zeus, not Yahweh, in the pagan poets. So Luke knows that Paul has misused the poet to actually try to confirm that that poet believed in Yahweh, or it could be used that way, and that's not how poetry works. I mean, they take it just as seriously as scripture because they believe these people were inspired. So saying that Zeus, we are all offspring of him, Zeus, cannot be applied to Yahweh because they're two different gods. But Paul's trying to lead them to believe that Yahweh is Zeus in this quotation from their poets. So you got to see it from their perspective, not from that. We know that Aratus is quoting something that's not from, not talking about Yahweh, so we know it's just an allegory. No, the pagans are hearing it. Hey, our God is the Jewish God. Zeus is really Yahweh, because that's what it sounds like. You're quoting a scripture, our poet scripture, and you're claiming that's your God. So that's what the pagans are going to hear. But and Luke knows this is biblically false. God is not Zeus. He doesn't live on Mount. He doesn't procreate with people physically in a humanoid being of himself. He doesn't live on Mount Olympus and so on. So Luke knows all these things are false. Luke knows there are 12 other gods in paganism, and Paul's picking the unknown God, number 13, would be simply understood to be the creator to his audience, and would require no change in their view of God. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, in part 2 on why does Luke depict Paul as almost entirely pagan in his mindset. Again, he's trying to win a brief. Use this brief to win a case that's pending. He's in Rome. He's keeping Paul company, and they're waiting for the trial, and this is how he's using his time. He's writing the book of Acts to help win a case. So why does Luke include this quote from we are his offspring? Paul knew the pagans are not offspring of God at this time, but like ourselves, they too are sons of Adam. He knows the biblical truth, but he wants to win this case. So he's willing to let Paul say things that are biblically untrue for that audience, but it's not intended for Christians or any of us to think the same way. That's be teaching us falsehood, biblical falsehood. So Luke's act is not intended for us to take as biblical truth what Paul's saying, or inspired for sure. These are completely inconsistent statements with the Bible, what Paul's uttering. Next, Luke knows we only can become later sons or daughters by our change in relationship, John 1:12. So we only become God's offspring by a spiritual birth, not by being born physically into this world, that we're his offspring. So Paul's statement is that we basically come to this world already God's children. Well, that's not how God wants us to see it, is that we are born human children to our parents, and then we can grow up and become followers of Yahweh. We don't, now we're innocent, if we're innocent and have no guilt, God treats children differently, until you reach an age of majority under the concept of Judaism, that you have to reach an age of majority before God's going to hold you accountable. But once you pass that line, I think it's age 13, that's when you now are going to be held accountable. And finally, Luke knew the pagans and all others were not in God, a pantheistic God. So he went along with that. He put it in there. That's what Paul said. Okay, but this is not intended for my Christian fellows, Christians. So we don't have to worry that anyone's going to hear this and think that that's what we think. This is just what Paul thinks. And we're trying to get him off of this, not get him convicted and killed, and then us become outlawed upsetting the temple grounds by bringing Trophimus in there. Okay, so now this brings us to a very important evidence or proof. Luke's intended audience are pagan investigators for a trial before Nero. How do we know that? Well, an excellent job was done by John Mock recently, an attorney. Paul on Trial, the Book of Acts as a Defense of Christianity, 2001 at page 4. He says that the Book of Acts was designed to get Paul off in a legal pending case before Nero, okay? And the Gospel of Luke, though, was intended to be more broadly interpreted to show what Christianity is really like. And maybe, in fact, if you want to know the truth, is what it really is like in distinction from Paul and how he talks in the book of Acts, because these are not the same. Jesus' God is not Paul's God. So maybe he wanted to make sure that the investigators would know, well, Christianity is a little bit more over here. Paul is way over there. Okay, that's probably what's going on. Anyway, here's what Mr. Mock says. Luke Acts was written as a legal defense of Paul, as he awaited trial before Nero and was intended to bring the gospel to Theophilus, even as he gathered facts concerning the charges against Paul. And I'd say it was not just to have the gospel for this one investigator. It was probably designed to be more universal, and that's why the apostles would have probably had to give approval to Luke to go and get access to the Hebrew Matthew. The physical copy was kept in this one library in, I think it's Pamphylius. I can't remember what it was, but it's a coastal town in North Africa, and so that's, it's a dry area, be preserved. There's a library that was heavily guarded in that era, so it would be preserved, and so on. And but that's what the book of Luke is. It's taken from the Hebrew Matthew. But Acts, that's Luke. I think Luke shows up in Acts 16, so he has to get the original first 15 chapters basically from his client, Paul, and so that has to be primarily his witness for that. But also, he probably met with the elders, meaning James, the bishop of Jerusalem, Jesus' brother, and then Peter and John, and maybe some of the other apostles, to do this. And we'll see this is not a new theory that Mr. Mock came up with. He was actually just reviving a theory that last had been revived in 1720, as we'll see next. Okay, so 1720 was the last time before Mock that this traditional view was revived, meaning that Acts was not meant for Christians. It was meant for a defense brief to prepare a defense for Paul at trial. So earlier, this view was restored in 1720 by C.A. Human in his article Dissertatio de Theophilo qui Lucas Historiam Sacrum inscripsit in the Bibliotheca Historico Theologica Classis, whatever, Bremen, 1720. Okay. In there, he argued that Luke wrote to the Roman magistrate Theophilus to defend against false accusations against Christianity. And basically, he pulled together all the evidence for that from ancient writings. Okay, so what was at stake in this trial? So the issue on appeal to Caesar was whether Paul brought Trophimus in an uncircumcised state inside the temple. If Paul lost, Christianity could be viewed as authorizing an act of defilement of the temple of Judaism, and Nero could strip Christianity of its legal right to operate under Judaism's official recognition as a religion approved by Rome. So this is all explained by Mr. Mock, but it makes common sense. Is if Christianity was only allowed, this is a Roman territory, Judea, Jerusalem and Judea and that region is all under Roman control. So your religion can't operate unless they allow you to operate. And they've allowed Judaism to operate, and in fact, they even protect its temple. But if you commit sacrilege against that temple as a different sect that's considered to have different ideas than Judaism, well, now we can outlaw you, because we're not going to have any, Rome does not want any sectarian violence or problems. So they're gonna punish the Christians and take them out if that's what's going on. So that's what's at stake, and that's why what Luke was probably brought along to help win this case. And being a doctor, maybe a professional medical doctor, maybe he was even a lawyer, that could help dramatically the church defend itself. And Luke did a great job. In fact, we're going to see whether he won or not, and how much we all do owe Luke for his great yeoman's effort here. And so going into that trial at Rome and they're waiting for, you have to know that one dilemma that Luke had was that there was no dispute that Trophimus did violate the temple. That's in Acts 21:29, 24:6, 13:18, Acts chapter 25 verses 7 to 8. So we've got our foot in trouble here, and you got to remember that what was never connected, the dots were never connected by Rome, as we'll see, because Trophimus, the guy who transgresses the barrier and is a friend of Paul's, from Ephesus, probably got the letter from the Ephesians. And in the second chapter of the epistle to the Ephesians, it says, God has taken away the middle wall of separation that kept us out of the temple. Well, if you read that and took that literally, not just spiritually, Trophimus could understand what Paul's saying is that these old barriers between us and God in an uncircumcised state, we can now go in. Paul said circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing. So it doesn't matter anymore. It means nothing to God. So Trophimus could have relied upon all those things, and we're just blessed that that epistle to the Ephesians never had wound its way to Nero, because that could have actually been used by the opponents of Paul and Christianity to say, hey, Trophimus went in there because of what Paul said previously. Okay, we didn't catch Paul with him, but he set the stage by telling him that the middle wall of separation has been spiritually removed somehow, that Gentiles can go in the temple now, even though Ezekiel 34 has Yahweh saying no uncircumcised Gentile can be inside the temple area. So anyway, there was no dispute that Trophimus was guilty. That's not even beyond doubt. Okay, so what was the defense on the merits, meaning not using all these other background facts? That Paul's saying the temple doesn't even have a God who lives there, and it's not built by human hands. He doesn't live there, and let's not get out of control here and kill me and kill Trophimus over something that's meaningless. That God doesn't even live there. So, what is really Paul's alibi, or what was he doing at the time that Trophimus went into the temple? So, Paul's testimony was that he was in a ceremonial washing at the time Trophimus, his traveling companion from Ephesus, violated the temple. Luke preserves that. This is the key to get Paul acquitted. For as mentioned above, Paul said his accusers merely found him, Paul, purifying himself in the temple. Acts 24, verse 18. This was Paul's sole defense of why he was not responsible for Trophimus profaning the temple. See Acts 21:28. So the charge against Paul was Paul brought Greeks also into the temple and defiled this holy place. So that was the problem. And so you can see there's a very limited case. It's simply Paul saying, I wasn't with him. What if it ever came out what happened, what Paul wrote the Ephesians? So that never happened. So we're just blessed. And Luke handled this astutely by the book of Acts, making the Paul appeal to a pagan audience as much as Paul allowed him to, because Paul provided a lot of grounds for that. And so also let's look at this on how a Christian would have perceived this. So this whole sequence of God does not live in temples made of human hands, as I mentioned, that undercuts that Trophimus did anything significant by entering the temple, right? Luke included a sequence that makes Paul look bad to Christians. In other words, we would look at him and go, this is repulsive. He doesn't understand who God is. God does live in the temple. He still lived in there. When Luke is writing, it's 54, 55 AD, and the temple doesn't get destroyed till 70. So Yahweh still lives there. This is not like it happened. The temple hasn't fallen yet. Yahweh is still there, living and dwelling. There's a flame that's constantly burning, miraculously, by the way, in the temple that represents that God dwells there. Okay, but he says this. Paul denies this most obvious biblical fact that God does dwell in temples made of human hands, because this appeals to the pagan court that's going to try him. So this is why Luke's including it. It's going to make a direct appeal to them. The Greek belief system, copied at Rome with different names, had 13 gods who resided at Mount Olympus. They generally did not reside at temples, but they were believed to visit for rituals in their honor. See Ancient Greek Religion. There's an article by that name. Thus, to pagans, Paul's claim that God does not live in a temple matched pagan thinking, thereby erasing among Paul's judges any concern about there being any truth that the Temple of Jerusalem was any kind of truly holy place where God resides. You see how so what he's saying completely undermined the anger and the hatred of the Jewish people who arrested him for having brought his friend, because they had seen him with him earlier at the temple, and now his friend violates the temple, and now they want him killed, they want to have him executed. But Paul has been these words that Paul used at Mars Hill can come back and resonate in the hearing of Nero, the hearing of Theophilus, hearing of any of the pagans who are actually trying this case, and hopefully we won't have a conviction. So, as I've been saying, Luke is not trying to make Christians like Paul. Luke is trying instead to make a pagan judge, Nero, and his investigators like Paul. In doing so, Luke knows he is saying preposterously false things. Luke knows that Paul is saying preposterously false things about the temple, but Luke sees their strategic advantage. That's being a good lawyer. You can put aside your own personal beliefs, your own personal knowledge of the nature of God, but this person's saying things that will appeal to the very court that's going to determine the fate of Christianity, and we can't have, whatever Paul says that can help us in their eyes, that is useful for defense, even though we would never want Christians to believe anything Paul's saying. That's really the bottom line. Okay, so what happened? Luke succeeded. Nero acquits Paul. Okay. Eusebius and Jerome both record that Paul was acquitted by Nero in this trial. Eusebius makes it emphatic that Paul was absolved of all crime, and there it is. Luke succeeded. So we, as Christians, we all owe a debt of gratitude to Luke for what he did. He had to use, in the book of Acts, things that he would never want us to hear or know about because he was trying to win a case. Doesn't want us to believe anything Paul's saying. But he used things that the pagans would like. And incidentally, and maybe we'll handle this in another video, is one of the most important things he put in there was in Acts 16:16. He had the Python priestess who sits at, she sits at Delphi, and she also sits at, oh gosh. Well, anyway, in the city that he was visiting is where she also prophesies. And so this is the most famous a prophetess of the ancient world at the time, and what her prophecies were written down and then circulated all over the empire, and people would read them like the news of the day. So whatever she said goes. And so for 2 weeks she's following Paul and telling people, quote, "This man teaches us a way of salvation." Okay, so you've got a person who's completely possessed by demons. She talks in babbling language. No one but a priest can interpret what she's saying, so they have to write down what she says and then give it to the customer who pays for her prophecy. So she was not for free, but when Nero would read that, or Theophilus reads that, oh my gosh, the Python, she said that he's the teaching us the way of salvation, so maybe he is. You see, that's what Paul, that was something Paul said. That's not something that actually happened. Oh, and then Paul gets irritated because, people are probably saying, hey, a demon's endorsing him. So the Christians are probably going, why would a demon endorse Paul? But Luke doesn't care about that here. He's trying to win a trial at Rome. So he's going to include this story because this is going to persuade, maybe more than even this event at Mars Hill, going to persuade Nero to rule in favor of Paul. So very strategic to include this story with the Python priestess. Very important. Again, completely downplayed by Christians now. They don't want to look at anything that's negative, and so they don't pay attention. But that's how you know this book is not meant for us. Because why would we be admiring someone who goes 2 weeks tolerating a demon, endorsing him, and he's getting popular? But the only people who would be upset with this is the people who are not pagan. The Jews and the Christians it's in Philippi. He's in Philippi in Macedonia, and so he's getting touted, and anyway, that and this part of the Mars Hill thing. These are two of the things that would show that Paul was of the same mindset of these people, and that their own pagan priestess, their high pagan priestess, the Python, she was called Python, and she's by the way, she's the voice mouth of Apollo, which is the god of the sun in their pagan religion. Okay, so and Nero quits Paul. Okay, and we're basically on our next to last slide. So I think it's worth mentioning here that Paul died in actually a natural death, and he was not a martyr. And I'm not saying this to make him less heroic to people or less whatever, but there is a myth that started going around when a movie came out recently called A Polite Bribe, and the narrator wrote a book to the same effect. And this is a book that's claiming that this whole thing at the temple and Paul's arrest over the defilement of the temple by Trophimus, that this was all prearranged and planned by James to actually kill Paul. And he then claims that Paul, in this trial before Nero, was executed. And he claims that therefore that James, the Bishop of Jerusalem, succeeded in what he was planning, and that this was, so he basically was the Judas to Paul, and he murdered Paul indirectly through proxies. That's basically the accusation. And but this person did not do his homework. I mean, Paul was acquitted in this trial, and what happens is he then dies a natural death, and the evidence of that is overwhelming, because you have a whole country of Spain that its history is that he came here, died, and was living here and died a natural death. Somehow, later in time, hundreds of years later, the myth was developed that he was killed as a martyr in Rome, and that served the interest of Rome at that time, because Paul was the only one of the 12, or actually one of the 13, to advocate against the Sabbath being kept. The others were all Sabbath proponents, but Paul wasn't, and he was believing no day was important. It doesn't matter what day you do it. If one man regards this day as important, another one regards that day. It's all up to you. It's whatever you want. That's what Paul's ultimate view was. It doesn't matter. You can do whatever you want. So that's why Constantine liked him, because now we can disconnect the Christians and the Jews from Sabbath and move everybody over to worship on the day of the sun, because Constantine was a worshiper of the sun. He was not a true Christian. That's a whole other video we can go into. And so that's why he was working hard, and that's why it was important to rehabilitate, make more of a myth about Paul, that he lived beyond where he really lived. So here's the truth. And this is still in the records of the church, but you have to be able to read this a little bit. Okay, so sometime before 70 AD, the Bishop of Rome, Clement, wrote an epistle. He wrote a first Clement to the Corinthians, chapter 5, verses 5 to 7, so you can look it up. He said after Paul had defended himself before rulers, so he apparently meant by that he had won. So he understands it was an acquittal. Paul reached the, quote, extremity of the west of the realm, likely meaning Spain. So if you're in Europe, you're in, let's say you're in Jerusalem or whatever, the west, the farthest west would be Spain. And this meant that Paul was not sentenced to death by Nero. Oh, wait, I missed the most important part. He said, and he then departed at length out of the world. That's a Roman expression or Latin expression, just as we have. Same idea. Well, he departed at length out of the world. That means he died. And so even Clement is saying he went to the farthest west part of the realm, which is Spain, and he went out of the world from that point. And that's actually the historical record that the Spaniards have. You can look it up. They have churches dedicated to where Paul lived, where he died, all this stuff. It's just total myth making later to change it. And there were 4 different stories of how Paul was brought before Nero and the grounds of his killing. So they're all in total conflict. So you can tell something's false when nobody can agree on what was the charge and what was that about. One was that he insulted a cupbearer, and the other is a lot of nonsensical alternatives. Let's just put it that way. Okay, so Paul died a natural death, and that's all. And that's correct. A lot of misinformation that goes on the internet. Okay, take care. God bless.